Nikita Kuzmenko is joining us, an analyst from the Hybrid Threat Analysis Group at the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center. Hello. Thank you for joining us.
Hello.
Good afternoon.
Nikita, could you explain the temporarily occupied Crimea, since it is now basically under the air control of the Ukrainian Defense Forces? Does this pose a danger and a problem for the Russian occupiers, who, since 2014, Crimea has been used as a logistical peninsula, a logistical territory?
Everything important you need to know today is already in the Freedom app. Live broadcasts, special projects, reports, and analysis. Just download the app from the App Store or Play Market and get up-to-date information wherever you are. Staying informed about important events with Freedom is easy.
Yes, actually, the question is how important Crimea is for the Russian side, and how much the Russian side has emphasized the importance of Crimea in military, strategic, political, and to some extent sociological terms. It's really hard to overestimate. Indeed, since 2014, we've constantly heard the rhetoric that Crimea is, among other things, Russia's unsinkable aircraft carrier. Indeed, comparisons between the capabilities of the Russian army and the American army have come up very often, with people saying, for example, that the American army can deploy its forces, including its air force, anywhere in the world because it has a large fleet of aircraft carriers. To this, Russia has always responded with the argument that we don't need that. We have Crimea. Crimea is our unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Black Sea. Obviously, this was in preparation for potential military actions in the Black Sea theater. And at the same time, this idea was actively developed both in theoretical discussions and in practice. The concept known as A to AD, anti-access area denial, or the access denial zone, which is about how in modern conditions of hybrid warfare, with small tactical groups of troops and new types of weaponry, these access denial zones will be the most effective. What is meant is a certain territory, a zone, in our case, the Crimean Peninsula, although it's not the only one. Throughout this time, Russia has been creating many such zones. For example, the Kaliningrad region is also an example of this concept. It was based on the idea that a deeply layered defense system needed to be created in this zone. This system would use air, land, and sea strike capabilities to prevent the enemy from conducting military operations in this area. In fact, that's why the number of anti-ship missile systems in Crimea, such as Ball and Bastion, has been constantly increasing. Others, which, with the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, began targeting ground objectives, essentially launching missiles like the well-known Onyx from Ukrainian territory. In addition, the air defense component of this access denial zone was constantly being strengthened. This included, once again, systems that are familiar to everyone, the well-known S-300 and S-400 systems, and others, more systems that operate against targets at a closer range. And of course, there's the ground component as well. This includes Iskanders, cruise missiles, both sea-based and land-based. Basically, from the strategic perspective of the Russian command, the idea was that it would really be possible to create a zone on the Crimean Peninsula where the enemy, which has always been and still is the Ukrainian Defense Forces, would not be able to operate without suffering catastrophic losses. However, what do we see now in practice? The development of unmanned aerial vehicles and other strike systems, which are now in service with the Ukrainian Defense Forces, has practically completely neutralized all the Russian advantages that have been built up over the years. And in fact, this area that was supposed to deny access to Ukrainian troops has turned into a no-go zone for Russian troops instead. Because the deeply layered defense system, which was designed to completely eliminate the possibility of strikes, including long-range strikes on Crimea, has proven to be absolutely ineffective. And every day, we see more and more evidence of this, that successful strikes are being carried out against air defense systems, for example, against S-400 missile systems. Even more importantly, against the radar elements of this system and other air defense systems. Against airfields, you already mentioned, in fact, the strike on the Havardisk airfield. There were also several strikes on the Saki airfield, and this has a very significant impact on the Russian Federation's ability to conduct combat operations. Because, for example, during the strike on the Havardiki airfield, a hangar was damaged where drones were kept, Shaheds, which are launched every day, including from the territory of Crimea. And they fly towards cities in Ukraine, in the south, and in other regions. As for the logistical side of this issue, there really are several routes by which Crimea is connected to the main territory of Russia. These are indeed the Kerch Bridge, the ferry crossing, and the so-called land corridor through the Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Donetsk regions. After a series of successful strikes by the Ukrainian armed forces on as for the Kerch Bridge, the movement of military cargo across it was actually stopped a long time ago. The ferry crossing is also under complete fire control and is constantly being destroyed. Even though this is, in principle, not a very expensive method of logistics to build and use, it is still constantly being destroyed, which complicates logistics. And recently, the land corridor, namely the so-called highway to Novorossiya, is also under the complete fire control of the armed forces of Ukraine, which makes it practically impossible to carry out any large-scale redeployment of Russian troops from the territory of so-called mainland Russia to the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine's southern regions, including Crimea.
It is also being reported now that Ukrainian drones are striking not only. There was a strike on occupied Crimea. Here is new information that an attack on the port at the Luga training ground happened today. This is fresh information. We will talk about this in more detail a little later on the air. By the way, let me add something about temporarily occupied Crimea. The situation there remains extremely tense because regular drone and missile strikes on military facilities, airfields, and Russian Federation logistics have disrupted the operation of critical infrastructure. This was reported by Iskander Buriev, head of the Crimean Tatar Resource Center. According to him, panic among Russians in Crimea has reached its peak amid constant explosions. And the resulting fuel and energy crisis and collapse, along with power outages on the peninsula, have caused accidents at pumping stations, which is why in many cities and towns, water supply has switched to emergency schedules. And when it comes to people's moods, most often there is hope that Crimea might to be liberated, added the head of the Crimean Tatar Resource Center. It's very important to point out to our viewers that the strikes are not targeting civilian infrastructure. Ukraine is only striking Kremlin military targets and those facilities that fund the Russian war machine. What we're seeing now in temporarily occupied Crimea are Russians joking in these kilometer-long traffic jams about how the traffic jam is made up of people who don't read the news. Speaking of those who do or don't read the news in Russia, it's clear how propaganda works. In many regions, people still don't know what's happening in temporarily occupied Crimea. But nevertheless, how would you assess the awareness, the realization among Russians right now of what's really going on? I'm talking specifically about the situation in temporarily occupied Crimea and within Russia itself. Also about the strikes on oil depots, fuel shortages at gas stations, and all these general sentiments. Which group is bigger right now? Those who are brainwashed by propaganda and still don't know what's going on? Or is the number of people who actually realize what's happening growing? How do you assess this?
There's an interesting point I want to highlight first of all. When we talk about how much awareness is actually happening in the Russian mindset. Indeed, the situation that is truly unfolding both in Crimea and across Russia as a whole. An interesting point is that the Russian Gauleiter of the Kherson region, Vladimir Saldo, recently compared what's happening now on the Crimean Peninsula to the siege of Leningrad. In general, we understand very well how much the Second World War is sacralized in the Russian collective consciousness, and especially episodes like the siege of Leningrad. And if even Russian officials, truly the occupation administrations, the Russian administrative vertical In these territories, they are already resorting to comparisons with such memorable events in Russian history as the Siege of Leningrad. Indeed, we can say that a certain shift in the collective consciousness has taken place. If we talk about who is currently winning, the power of Russian propaganda or the power of Ukrainian weapons, honestly, it's pretty hard to say. Because, for example, some recent sociological studies show that the number of supporters is indeed actively growing. The idea of holding peace negotiations with Ukraine among Russian society. The number of people who are ready for a ceasefire with Ukraine is actively growing. And the number of those who are willing to keep fighting, to go on until victory, till the very end, is really decreasing. However, we shouldn't see these numbers as an unequivocally positive sign, because at the same time, we see that the conditions under which Russian society, are ready to end at least the active phase of hostilities, ready to agree to a ceasefire, to hold negotiations, or to accept any kind of truce, are, of course, still very much based on the Kremlin's position. Because, in fact, the current position of Russian society can be described as a truce, either a victorious one or a truce without defeat. Because there really are certain things that Russian society is not willing to accept. These, of course, include Ukraine joining NATO, the return of the occupied territories of Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson region, and other seized territories. These are, let's say, admitting guilt, acknowledging defeat, and Russia paying reparations to Ukraine. So basically, Russian society is ready for peace, or at least a truce, but only a truce on Russia's terms. Because, as I already said, right now the number of people who are ready to agree to a truce is over 60%, and the number of those who are ready to agree to a truce only and exclusively on Russia's terms is approaching 75%. So we can see that these two numbers are somewhat correlated with each other. Moreover, in Russian society right now, there's a prevailing trend to shift all responsibility for starting, conducting, and ending this war exclusively and personally onto the authorities, and specifically Vladimir Putin's. That's why so many Russians say they are ready to accept any terms for a truce or peace with Ukraine if those terms are presented by the Russian authorities and Vladimir Putin as a victory. In other words, we come to the conclusion that Russian society does not want to take responsibility. It wants to distance itself from this war as much as possible and shift the blame onto the Russian authorities. In this regard, it will indeed be very interesting to watch how the situation changes, specifically in terms of what conditions Russians are willing to accept for a truce. Because I still think that unless something extraordinary happens on the battlefield, unless the combat capability and readiness of Russian troops suddenly increase several dozen times, and unless Russia becomes ready to launch large-scale offensive operations, which in reality is not expected, I don't see any trend toward an increase in the number of Russians who want to continue the war. To keep fighting until total victory, that number will not grow. It'll keep declining. But really, the situation regarding the terms that Russian society is willing to accept for a ceasefire is interesting. It will be interesting to keep watching how that develops.
Vicky, we have a minute and a half left until the nationwide moment of silence in Ukraine. I have time to ask you a question. It's very interesting. You say that Russian society wants or will want to end the war on Russia's terms. But I have a question. You've seen Pokrovsk, what it looks like now. You've seen what Bakhmut looks like, and so on and so on. Why do Russians need this? Pokrovsk, Kupiansk, Kostiantynivka? Cities that Russia has wiped off the face of the earth? Just a minute, literally.
I'll answer quickly. It's not cities, land, or territories. It's about Russian chauvinism and the sense of greatness of the Russian people. The most important thing for Russian society is that these two feelings are not hurt. And basically, for this, any conditions that the Kremlin considers beneficial will be called a victory, and Russian society will accept them.
Daiju, Thank you very much, Nikita, for joining our broadcast. Nikita Kuzmenko, an analyst from the Hybrid Threat Analysis Group at the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center, was with us live.